Good morning. This is History 2463 entitled Assembly of Greater Men and subtitled Le Coup d'État, Fall 2022.
September 7th, 2022 9:11 a.m. Chapter 3. Here we discuss Article 1 Section 5, where elections are to be free and equal.
Elections free and equal. Madison County is located in western Tennessee, lying on the road to and about 2/3 the distance between Nashville and Memphis. It is named after the fourth President of the United States, James Madison. President from 1809 to 1817, Madison was an American statesman, diplomat, philosopher, expansionist, and founding father. Called the "Father of the Constitution," Madison co-wrote the Federalist Papers with Alexander Hamilton. Parts of land purchased from the Chickasaw in 1818 formed the county. The second tallest mound of earthwork in the United States and one of the most extensive mound complexes, Pinson Mounds in that county, dates back to the Woodland period, c. 1 to 500 CE. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 pushed most Chickasaw beyond the Mississippi westward. Areas Native Americans camped continued to be havens where the Royal Assembly of Greater Men of Madison County would congregate, but when, where and why?
Jefferson Madison Freeman was called by all he cared for as Mr. President, and those who didn't as "Hey, free slave." His father was Jefferson Madison, and his father was named George Jefferson. All were scholars, gentlemen, slaves, and greater men. See, slavery wasn't as taxing as it seems it was today, whereas there were levels of servitude that allowed some to eat, live, and breathe with more significance than others. Mr. President, as they called him, was an astronomer and mathematician. After completing his education with the Greater Men of Madison County, he was able to orchestrate his sale to a local bookkeeper, where he assisted in the preparation of federal taxes owed by the amount of grain, corn, or whatever was distributed. He knew his company's distribution and estimated that of other companies to determine the population dependent on the community. See, a community could claim an entire county and be just 700 registered voters in an area the size of one of today's larger-sized subdivisions. The reality of the outside world that they were as insignificant as they were created a nucleus of belief that would only grow. Sure, there would be casualties, but Mr. President saw that all under his auspices would be heard, but how?
Being drawn to astronomy at an early age, he chose to focus on it while studying under the greater men. Making his field a little more digestible, he spoke of astrology and being born November 4th like the scorpion his sign represents. His strike was as swift as a scorpion, and many said it was as detrimental. Mr. President was a master of timing, as he claimed to have lined up the stars for the timing he put on the many knockout punches for which he was famous. But greater men didn't fight all the time, as they had built up a reputation and hierarchy where, when the stars were aligned, they would fight for supremacy. The first Tuesday in November would decide the leadership of the Royal Assembly of Counties every Olympiad, where without an astronomer to inform others whether the stars were aligned or when was the best time to attack, there would be no need in assembling greater men, and Mr. President knew that first and perhaps foremost. He would imply, there is no need to strike, when one has lost except out of spite. We strike when the iron is hot to do the most damage to the enemy.
Mr. President mimicked the office in most every way he heard, read, or surmised. He especially heard about Madison, read about his work on the Constitution, and surmised about the Federalist Papers. He knew that all men were created equal and saw how they fall in line with whatever caste their parents happened to be in. Being grateful that he was a product of the greater men, he calculated the number of votes necessary to be elected for all extensive purposes to become president in that Madison County. Being literate, he got a hold of some paper, labeled it Jefferson Madison Freeman for President, and campaigned as a write-in candidate for the 1860 national elections. With President James Buchanan advocating for states' rights and minimizing federal government intervention on slavery, the Grand Consistory of Royal Assemblies of Tennessee counties were brought to the forefront as Freeman's campaign proved what slaves would do if freed. Though most of the marks were illegible as signatures, all were distinct, which proved that of the votes counted for Lincoln, Breckinridge, Bell, and Douglas, Freeman was the victor in that county, but the state went to Bell. Lincoln won the election, and Freeman, though for secession to maintain the caste system in place where greater men were bred, trained, and oriented to formal black society, remained known as Mr. President of a county where, if the South would have won, he would be king. Jefferson and Madison were his given names, but being a Freeman and of the greater men, he could at least see the liberty more clearly than most who would never understand.
He had a certain light or aura that shone around him which drew people to want to be in his presence, but that same quality repelled reciprocally those who came against him. If slaves were allowed to fight in the Confederate Army, Jefferson Madison Freeman would be of the first to sign up, because in order to maintain what structure the South had in balancing the peace along the racial divide, the greater men stood as an arbitrator of justice. Why? Well, because one couldn't just treat a slave any way he may prefer without some type of consequence, where the court of the Royal Assembly heard and acted on issues that would normally fall on deaf ears. This aura he had that welcomed justice was at its peak just before the war, where in some cases even some European Americans sought the court's favor. Setting times and dates according to the celestial bodies, the meetings for legislating, executing, and judging only seemed to be sporadic gatherings of individuals of African persuasion, where many were slaves, some were free, but all presiding were greater men. That is all for this session. We will meet again next Wednesday, the 14th of September at 9:11 a.m. for Chapter 4.
We have a pop quiz following our next session, so it would behoove you to reread your text and study your notes in preparation.